It was late October, 1997, when I decided to camp out in the old Ridgeway Cemetery on the outskirts of Sheffield. I was 24 at the time, still thinking I was invincible, and I had this idea in my head that it would be a different sort of camping experience. I'd been camping plenty of times in woods and hills, but never in a graveyard. It wasn't meant to be a dare, just something unusual. I'd seen the place in daylight before. Overgrown grass, crooked headstones leaning like they'd had enough of standing, and a rusty iron gate that barely closed. The sun was already sinking when I walked in, backpack slung over my shoulder. The air felt colder than it had been in town. The trees that lined the edges were nearly bare, with their last few leaves scraping against one another when the wind moved through. The ground was soft in places, muddy in others. I stepped carefully between graves, some so old the names had worn completely away. The cemetery wasn't large, maybe 200 yards from end to end, but it felt enclosed, like it sat in its own pocket of air away from the rest of the world. I set up my tent in what I thought was the flattest spot I could find, just off to one side near a collapsed stone wall. The ground was lumpy, the kind of unevenness you only notice once you're lying down, but it was manageable. As I hammered the tent stakes in, I could hear the distant hum of traffic from the road about half a mile away. It was faint enough that I could pretend I was far from any other people. By the time I got my sleeping bag unrolled, the light was gone. I didn't bother with a fire. It didn't seem right in a graveyard, and I'd brought a small camping stove instead. I made tea in a metal mug, the steam curling up and disappearing almost instantly into the cold air. My breath came out white too, and I could feel it sticking to my face. I kept my headlamp on its lowest setting, not wanting to throw too much light around. After eating a couple of sandwiches, I decided to walk the perimeter before fully settling in. The moon was just a thin slice in the sky, so most of my light came from the headlamp's narrow beam. My boots crunched on gravel in some areas and sank slightly in others where the grass was thick. Every few minutes, I'd hear a sound that wasn't mine. A twig snapping, leaves rustling. But each time I stopped to listen, it faded away. I told myself it was just small animals. When I got back to the tent, I switched off the light for a while, just to sit in the dark and listen. The cold was sharp, cutting into my fingers and the tip of my nose. Somewhere behind me, I heard something metallic rattle, a sound like a chain or maybe a loose gate hinge, but it didn't repeat. I decided to lie down and zip myself into the sleeping bag. I just started to drift when I heard it again. This time it wasn't metallic. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the grass. I froze. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time. I lay as still as I could, trying to listen past the pounding in my ears. It wasn't the shuffling of an animal. It was too heavy, too regular. The steps circled to the side of the tent. I could hear breathing now, faint, but definitely there. I reached for my headlamp and switched it on, the beam catching the thin fabric wall. A shadow passed across it, tall, narrow shoulders, and a head that seemed to tilt slightly as if listening. My throat went dry. I didn't call out. I didn't want to. I just waited, gripping the handle of my small folding knife inside the sleeping bag. The shadow stayed still for maybe 10 seconds, then slowly moved away. The footsteps grew fainter, heading toward the far end of the cemetery. I thought about unzipping the tent and looking, but part of me didn't want to see. Instead, I sat there with the light still on, trying to convince myself it could have been someone passing through. Maybe a drunk, maybe just curious. But it was past midnight now, and who walks into a graveyard at this time unless they have a reason? After about 20 minutes, I unzipped the tent halfway and looked out. The moon had shifted higher, giving the place a pale, uneven light. I scanned the rows of stones but saw nothing moving. My breath hung in front of me, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I was debating whether to pack up right then when I heard another sound, this one from behind the collapsed wall where I'd set up camp. It was the sound of something brushing through the grass, moving low but fast. I grabbed my torch and stepped out, the cold hitting me like water. My boots sank into the damp ground. I swung the light toward the wall, but the beam just showed a mess of weeds and stone. Then, without warning, I heard a sharp clink of metal again, this time right near the gate. I walked slowly toward it, my breath loud in my own head. When I reached the gate, it was swinging slightly, creaking as it moved. The chain that usually hung from one post was on the ground. I scanned the road beyond, empty. No footsteps, no voices, no cars. I looked down and saw fresh prints in the soft dirt leading away from the cemetery and into the trees beyond. They were boot prints about my size, and they were recent. That's when I realized something. The only way into this place at night without forcing the gate is from the far corner where the fence is broken. Whoever it was must have known that. They hadn't just wandered in, they'd chosen to come in. I didn't waste any more time. I went straight back to the tent, shoved everything into my pack without bothering to fold it properly, and slung it over my shoulder. My hands were shaking as I worked the straps. The wind had picked up, whistling through the gaps in the wall, making the dead leaves scuttle across the ground like tiny feet. As I left, I kept my torch low, scanning between the graves. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched didn't leave. My boots felt too loud against the gravel path. I reached the road and didn't stop walking until I was well into the lit part of town. Only then did I allow myself to slow down. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The whole walk home, I kept thinking about the breathing outside my tent, the slow, deliberate steps, and the way they'd stop to just listen. Whoever it was had no reason to be there at that hour except to watch. I never went back to Ridgeway Cemetery after that. Even now, years later, whenever I'm camping, I make sure I know exactly who could walk into my campsite. And I never, ever let myself forget that the scariest thing in any graveyard isn't under the ground. It's whoever's walking above it in the dark. I was 31 the summer I decided to camp alone in the woods near the Welsh border. It was late September 2019. The days were still warm, but the nights had begun to cool, and the weather had a habit of changing without warning. I had been hiking since the early afternoon, following a narrow trail that cut through rolling hills and small pockets of dense forest. My rucksack was heavy with gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooking stove, a few tins of food, and the usual odds and ends I always carried. I didn't mind the weight. I liked the rhythm of walking alone, the quiet, the way time slowed down when you were far from everything. By late evening, clouds had thickened overhead, a dull gray ceiling that swallowed the last of the light earlier than I expected. I found a small clearing near a slow-running stream, about a mile off the main trail. The ground was uneven in spots, but there was a patch of short grass that looked flat enough for the tent. I could hear the distant rush of water further downstream, and every now and then a gust of wind stirred the branches above. I pitched the tent quickly, my fingers moving on muscle memory. The smell of damp earth rose from the ground, and the air had that heavy stillness it gets right before rain. By the time I got my gear inside, it was nearly dark. I boiled some water on the small stove and made tea, sitting cross-legged in the open tent flap, watching the shadows deepen between the trees. The forest around me seemed empty, but every so often I'd catch a flicker of movement, a branch shifting, leaves twitching, and my eyes would snap toward it. Most likely just wind or small animals. I told myself that, but I still found my shoulders tensing. It started to rain just after 9. At first, it was just a soft patter, the kind you can ignore, but within minutes it grew heavier. The sound filled the air, a constant drumming on the tent fabric. I zipped myself inside, stretched out in the sleeping bag, and listened to the rain work its way through the forest. The wind rose in slow surges, rattling the tent poles. The smell of wet grass and fabric filled the small space. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. At first I thought it was the wind that had stirred me, but then I heard something else, faint but distinct over the rain. A crunch of footsteps on wet ground. Slow, deliberate. My eyes adjusted to the dim light inside the tent, my ears straining. The rain masked most noises, but every few seconds, there it was again. The sound came from somewhere behind the tent, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. I lay completely still. The footsteps stopped. The rain carried on. After a minute, I told myself it might have been a deer or a badger moving around. There was no reason for anyone to be here. This clearing was well off any marked route, and the weather was miserable. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it had stopped because it knew I was awake. The tent felt smaller than ever. I shifted slowly, reaching for my torch, careful not to make the sleeping bag rustle too loudly. I didn't turn it on. Instead, I waited. The seconds stretched. Then, just barely audible over the rain, I heard the sound again, this time to the side of the tent, closer. Not a scurrying animal. Heavier, more human. The hair on my arms prickled. I gripped the torch so hard my knuckles ached. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I thought about unzipping the tent, shining the light outside, but the idea of putting my hand out into the dark stopped me cold. I stayed where I was, barely breathing, listening. After what felt like an hour, though it was probably just a few minutes, the sound faded. Footsteps retreating into the rain. Eventually, they were gone. I didn't sleep again. I stayed on my side, torch still in hand, waiting for light. When dawn finally came, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. My legs were stiff as I crawled out of the tent. The clearing looked unchanged, but the grass around the tent was flattened in several spots. Fresh mud churned up where the ground had been softer. I walked a slow circle, scanning the area. About 15 feet from where I slept, near the edge of the trees, there were footprints.
Bare footprints. No shoes, no boots.
Just pale impressions in the mud, toes clear. The heels sunk deep where the person had put their weight. They weren't mine. I hadn't been barefoot since I got there. I crouched down, counting them. 7 clear prints, each about the length of my hand. The stride was uneven, as if the person had been stepping carefully. They led from the trees toward my tent and then curved away, disappearing into the undergrowth. The rain had softened their edges, but they were fresh enough that I knew they'd been made last night. I felt an ache in my stomach, the kind that comes when you realize something is not right and never was. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, just wet trunks and dripping branches. Whoever it had been could be miles away by now or standing perfectly still, watching. I didn't want to find out which. I packed up fast. My hands shook as I rolled the sleeping bag, shoved gear into the rucksack without care. The rain picked up again, cold against the back of my neck. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see a shape between them. I left the clearing without looking back, following the faint path toward the main trail. My boots sank into mud, each step loud in my own head. The forest felt different in daylight, less like a place and more like something alive that wanted me gone. By the time I reached the main trail, my clothes were soaked through. I didn't stop walking until I saw the outline of a road in the distance. Even then, I kept checking behind me, certain I'd see someone following. I never did. I told no one the details, not friends, not family. When people asked how the trip went, I said it was fine, just wet and cold. But the truth stayed with me. I still don't know who was out there that night, or why they came so close without saying a word. All I know is that in the middle of that storm, someone stood just a few feet from where I slept, barefoot in the rain, watching. And that's something I'll never camp alone with again. had planned the trip months before it happened. I was 24, and I'd been feeling like life was just a dull routine. I worked at a small mechanics shop in Colorado, and most of my weeks were just grease, tools, and going home to a one-bedroom apartment. My dad used to take me camping when I was a kid, and lately I had been missing that feeling of being far from people, far from traffic, far from anything predictable. It was early September 2017 when I finally decided to go alone. My friends either couldn't get the time off or thought camping by myself was a stupid idea. I didn't care. I wanted the quiet, the smell of pine, and the sense that no one in the world knew exactly where I was. I packed my old tent, a sleeping bag, a small propane stove, enough food for 4 days, and a cheap headlamp that I'd bought at a hardware store the week before. The place I picked was somewhere I'd never been before, San Juan National Forest, in the southwestern corner of the state. I'd read online that you could hike off some of the lesser-used trails and find open spots to camp, no official site, no neighbors. That sounded perfect. I drove out early in the morning, stopped for gas in a little town an hour away from my destination, and finally parked near a narrow dirt road that my old Civic barely handled. The trailhead wasn't marked with anything more than a bent metal sign. I shouldered my pack and walked until I could no longer hear the faint hum of distant cars. The hike in took me about an hour and a half. I found a spot just beyond a small clearing, surrounded on 3 sides by thick trees. There was a little rise in the ground that gave me a decent view over a dry creek bed about 30 yards away. I set up the tent, collected some firewood, and spent the rest of the afternoon cooking noodles and watching the sunlight thin through the branches. By nightfall, the forest was still. No wind, no running water, just the occasional snap of a twig from some small animal I couldn't see. I went to sleep earlier than I expected, maybe around 9, just listening to the quiet through the thin nylon walls of the tent. I woke up sometime after midnight. It wasn't to a sound at first. It was the feeling that something had shifted around me. The air felt colder, but it wasn't just temperature. It was the stillness. Usually, even deep in the woods, you hear something at night. Bugs, distant owls, small rustles in the undergrowth. But it was silent. My ears felt almost strained, like they were searching for a noise that wasn't there. Then I heard it. It came from somewhere down near the creek bed. It was the sound of movement, but not steady walking. It was uneven. A few steps, a pause, another step, then 2 quick ones. It wasn't a deer. I'd grown up hearing deer before. They moved lighter, quicker, and in a sort of continuous way. This sounded wrong. I sat up inside the tent, heart starting to pick up speed. My headlamp was within reach, but I didn't turn it on yet. I just listened. The steps came closer, then stopped entirely. That's when I heard breathing. It was faint but deliberate, and it wasn't coming from far away anymore. It was somewhere just beyond the edge of my camp, maybe 20 feet off. My first thought was that it was another camper, maybe lost or trying to find their way through. But there was something about the breathing. It wasn't fast like someone tired from hiking. It was slow, controlled. I stayed still for a while, hoping it would pass. Then, from the darkness, I heard something else. It was my name. I can't explain exactly how it was said. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even a normal speaking voice. It was like someone had shaped my name in their mouth and let it out in a low, uneven tone, stretching it just slightly too long. I felt a cold ripple go through my whole body. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going. No one. I finally clicked on my headlamp and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the trees, catching shapes of branches, but nothing moved. The breathing had stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept the headlamp on and my small camping knife in my hand. Every time I thought I might be imagining it, I would catch a faint shuffle in the leaves outside my line of sight. It never came close again that night, but it also never fully went away. Morning didn't bring relief. If anything, I felt more uneasy seeing the pale light on the clearing. I noticed something that hadn't been there when I set up my tent. Faint depressions in the dirt near the edge of the trees, like footprints. They weren't clean shoe prints, just elongated impressions. They looked wrong in shape, as if someone had walked barefoot but with longer, narrower feet than a normal person. I thought about packing up right then, but my stubborn side told me not to let one creepy night ruin the trip. I stayed another day, though I didn't wander far from camp. I cooked, read a paperback I'd brought, and tried to shake it off. Night 2 was worse. The noises started earlier, around 10 p.m. This time, there were no long silences between steps. The pacing was steady, circling my camp at a distance. I kept the fire going longer than I normally would have, the flames throwing light into the trees. At one point, I caught movement, tall, pale, and gone in a split second, as if it had stepped back behind a tree the moment my eyes found it. I didn't hear my name again, but there were sounds that seemed like someone trying to imitate a human voice. Little bursts of garbled syllables, too soft to make out but too strange to be animal calls. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sky began to lighten, I was already rolling up my sleeping bag. I didn't care about breakfast. I stuffed everything into my pack and got out of there. The hike back felt longer. Several times I had the strong sensation that I wasn't alone on the trail, though every time I stopped and looked, nothing was there. When I finally reached the dirt road and saw my car, I felt this deep, shaky relief. As I drove out, I passed through that small town again. I stopped for gas, and the man at the counter made a casual comment about me being up in those woods. I just nodded. I never told him or anyone else exactly what I saw or heard. I didn't want to deal with the smirks or the "you were just tired" speeches. But I know this, those woods weren't empty, and whatever was out there knew my name. It was late September 2015 when I decided to take a short camping trip in the English countryside. I'd been working long hours for months, and the idea of a quiet weekend in nature sounded perfect. I picked a small, lesser-known campsite in Derbyshire, a place that had only a few scattered pitches in a grassy field surrounded by trees. It wasn't a commercial site with neat gravel paths and caravans. It was basic, just a clearing, a few fire pits, and an old water pump near the entrance. I liked the simplicity. I arrived early in the afternoon, parking my small hatchback just off the narrow lane that led into the site. The air was cool and damp, with a thin layer of mist clinging to the tops of the grass. I could smell wet soil and faint with smoke from somewhere far off. The place was nearly empty. There were only 2 other tents that I could see, one on the far side of the field, near the treeline, and another close to the entrance. Both looked unoccupied at the moment. I chose a spot near the middle of the field, far enough from the trees to avoid branches falling on me in the night, but still close enough to feel some shelter from the wind. As I unpacked my gear, I noticed how quiet it was. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, not even many birds. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of every tiny sound. My boots crushing the damp grass, the faint rattle of my tent poles in their bag, the drip of water from somewhere unseen. By late afternoon, my tent was up, my sleeping bag unrolled, and a small camping stove ready for tea. The sun was already sinking lower, turning the mist into a pale gold haze. I sat outside, watching it fade, and I remember thinking that this was exactly the peace I'd been craving. It wasn't until early evening that I first noticed him. I was walking toward the water pump with my empty bottle when I saw movement near the edge of the field. A man was standing at the far treeline, partly hidden in the shadows. He was tall, with a lean build, wearing a dark coat that looked too heavy for the mild weather. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, facing the field. At first, I thought he might be one of the other campers, maybe just taking a break or stretching his legs. But something about his posture made me uneasy. He wasn't looking around or walking, just fixed in place, as if he was watching something. I glanced toward the two other tents, but I saw no one else. I filled my bottle quickly and walked back to my tent, trying not to look at him again. When I sat down, I risked another glance toward the trees. He was still there. Same spot, same stillness. As the light faded, I tried to distract myself by making a small meal. The smell of pasta and tin sauce filled the air, and I focused on eating slowly, listening to the faint hiss of the stove. When I looked again toward the treeline, he was gone. I told myself he had probably just been another camper or maybe even a hiker passing through. Still, I kept glancing around as I cleaned my pot and tucked it away. Darkness came quickly, the kind that feels heavier in the countryside, where there are no street lamps or shop lights to soften it. I sat for a while with a small torch, reading, until the chill made me retreat into my tent. Inside, the air felt warmer and safe, the thin nylon walls cutting me off from the blackness outside. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was fully night. The air felt colder, and my breath fogged in front of me. I was lying still, half awake, when I heard it, faint crunching in the grass. At first, I thought it might be a fox or some other animal, but the steps were slow, deliberate. They came from the direction of the trees, moving across the field. I froze, every muscle tight. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, closer this time. I could hear the weight in the steps, the way the grass gave under them. They stopped again, and in the silence I became aware of my own heartbeat, fast and shallow. I reached for my torch and switched it on, shining the beam toward the side of the tent. Through the thin fabric, I could see a vague shadow. Someone was standing just a few feet away. The light must have startled him, because the shadow moved quickly, and the steps began again, this time heading away. I stayed still for a long time after the sound faded, clutching the torch, listening to every rustle. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the idea of stepping outside made my skin crawl. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but eventually I must have drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, the sky was pale with early morning light. The field was silent again, empty except for the two other tents. I stepped outside, scanning the area. The grass around my tent was damp and flattened, and in the soft earth near one of the pegs, I saw it, a footprint. Large, clearly from a boot, and deep enough to suggest someone had been standing there for a while. I packed quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into the car. I didn't look toward the trees until I was about to leave. That's when I saw him again. He was farther away this time, partly hidden by a rise in the land, but I could tell it was the same man. He stood still, facing the field, the morning mist curling around him. I didn't wait to see if he moved. I started the car, turned onto the lane, and drove until the campsite was far behind me. Later, when I thought about it, I realized the other two tents had never shown signs of life. No movement, no smoke from cooking, no voices. Maybe they'd been abandoned, or maybe they were just props to make the place seem less empty. Either way, I couldn't shake the image of that man, standing silent in the mist, watching. I never went back to that part of Derbyshire. Even now, years later, I can still picture his shape in the trees, waiting. And I still wonder if he'd been there before I arrived, watching the field for hours, maybe days, looking for someone who came alone. And if I hadn't shown that torch when I did, I wonder how much closer he might have come. I had been planning the trip for weeks. It was early autumn, 2013, and the air had that sharp, dry bite in the mornings that told me the year was beginning to wind down. I had just turned 28 and felt the itch to get out of the city for a while. Too many late nights, too much screen time, and the constant hum of traffic had started to wear on me. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind you can only get miles away from the nearest streetlight. I decided on a place I'd only read about in a small hiking forum, a remote stretch of woodland in northern Idaho. It wasn't an official campsite. No paved lots, no ranger stations, no toilets. Just rough trails that faded the deeper you went in. The few people who had written about it said it was peaceful, untouched, and never busy. That sounded perfect to me. I parked my old Subaru at the very end of a cracked dirt road, just before the ground dropped off into a steep ravine. From there, I slung my pack over my shoulders and started walking. The trail was narrow, the kind that had clearly been made by deer and not humans. It wound between tall pines and uneven clusters of rock. Fallen branches snapped under my boots, and dry leaves crunched. After a few hours, I found a spot that felt right. Flat enough for my small tent, sheltered from the wind by a cluster of fir trees, and far enough from the path that I wouldn't see anyone, even if they were passing through. The first night was calm. I made a small fire, heated a can of soup, and sat there watching the flames eat away at the wood. The forest around me was dark, but not uncomfortably so. The sounds were just normal forest sounds, distant owls, the faint rush of water from somewhere downhill, and the occasional snap of a twig. I went to bed early, my sleeping bag pulled tight against the cold. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire was dead, the tent was pitch black, and the night air felt heavier, like the temperature had dropped fast. I stayed still, listening. At first, I thought I was hearing the wind through the trees, but the sound was too uneven. It was more like slow, careful footsteps on dry leaves, somewhere out in the darkness. They would start, then stop. Start again. Stop. I told myself it could have been an animal. A deer, maybe, but the weight of the steps seemed wrong. Too heavy, but too cautious. I lay there for a long time, holding my breath without realizing it. The sound eventually faded, and I fell asleep again, though it was a shallow, uneasy kind of sleep. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. The air was cold and smelled faintly of wet earth. I boiled some instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and went to explore a little. I hiked a few miles out, following the sound of the stream I'd heard the night before, and found it cutting through a narrow clearing. I stayed there for a while, skipping stones and taking pictures, before heading back to camp in the late afternoon. When I returned, something felt off immediately. My tent wasn't where I'd left it. It was still there, just shifted slightly, like someone had dragged it a few feet to the side. At first I thought maybe the wind had done it, but my pack had been inside. It was too heavy to just blow over. I checked my gear. Everything was there, but the zipper on my pack was open halfway. I didn't like that. I didn't like it at all. But there were no footprints I could see. The ground was too covered with leaves to leave much of a trail. I decided I'd keep my fire going longer that night. As dusk set in, the woods seemed to close in tighter. The shadows between the trees deepened until they looked like solid walls. I sat by the fire, staring into it until my eyes blurred, trying not to think too much about the tent being moved. But that quiet from last night returned. Only this time I could feel it pressing against me. I didn't hear footsteps, but I knew something was out there. It wasn't until I went to get more firewood that I saw it. About 30 feet from my camp, on the other side of a deadfall log, was a small pile of stones. Perfectly stacked, 5 in total, each one smaller than the one beneath it. I hadn't seen it earlier. I was sure of that. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring at it until the cold started to bite at my fingers. Then I turned and went back to camp, my chest tight. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire going until almost dawn, my ears straining at every crack and rustle. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to wait around to find out who or what was out here. I packed up quickly, shoving my gear into my bag without caring if it was neat. As I bent to take down the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There was another pile of stones, this one right behind where my tent had been. Same size, same perfect stacking. I didn't waste any more time. I got everything together and started back toward the car. The hike out felt longer than the hike in. The air was still, too still, and every so often I thought I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow slipping behind a tree, a flicker of pale color in the undergrowth. I didn't look directly, I just kept walking. By the time I saw the car, my legs were aching and my shirt was damp with sweat, even in the cold. But the relief was short-lived. On the hood of my Subaru, right above the grill, sat another stack of stones. 5 perfectly balanced. I didn't stop to knock it over. I didn't take pictures. I just got in, locked the doors, and drove until the forest was nothing but a smear of green in the rearview mirror. I've gone camping since then, but never alone, and never anywhere near Idaho. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some old campfire story. It was real, and it knew exactly where I was every single night. I had been planning the trip for a couple of weeks, nothing too fancy, just a solo camping weekend deep in the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. It was late October 1997, and the weather had cooled enough that the bugs weren't bad, but the nights could get cold. I was 28 then, still in decent shape, and the idea of being alone in the woods didn't bother me. I wanted quiet, no noise from traffic, no people, no schedules, just the crackle of a fire and the sound of wind in the trees. I drove out early Friday morning, the bed of my old Ford Ranger packed with my tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a small cooler of beer. The dirt road leading into the forest was narrow and uneven, with deep ruts from rain earlier in the week. I had to take it slow, bouncing over rocks and weaving between overhanging branches. The air smelled damp and earthy, like wet leaves and pine. I finally found a spot about half a mile off the main trail. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat patch of ground near a small creek. I liked it because the trees around it were tall and thick, almost like a natural wall, and the creek was close enough that I could hear the water moving. It felt private, hidden. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and spent most of the afternoon fishing in the creek. I didn't catch much, just a couple of small trout, but it was peaceful. By sundown, I had a small fire going. The flames flickered against the trees, and the air kept dropping colder. I ate, had a beer, and watched the fire until it was nothing but glowing embers. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sound of the creek mixing with the occasional crack of branches somewhere in the forest. I wasn't worried about animals. It was more likely a raccoon or deer than anything dangerous. Still, I kept my .38 revolver close, not out of paranoia, just habit. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The tent was dark, my breath visible in the cold air. I lay still, listening. The creek was still there, faint and steady, but there was something else. A slow, deliberate sound. Leaves crunching, not constant, but spaced out, like someone trying to move quietly. It wasn't coming from one direction. First, I heard it off to my left, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. Then silence. Then a few more crunches behind me, closer this time. My first thought was a deer, maybe circling the tent out of curiosity. But deer don't usually take long pauses between steps, and they don't move in such a wide arc unless they're nervous. I stayed still for a long time, gripping the revolver. Eventually, the sound faded, and I told myself it was nothing. I tried to go back to sleep. In the morning, the air was crisp and clear. I stepped out of the tent, stretching, and my eyes went straight to the ground. Around my campsite, in the soft dirt and patches of leaves, there were footprints, human footprints, They weren't huge, but they were clearly from boots, the kind with deep tread. The strange thing was they weren't coming from the trail. They came from the opposite direction, out of the deeper forest, and stopped about 10 feet from my tent before turning away again. I didn't like it. Out here, miles from the nearest road, people didn't just wander by. Whoever it was had been close enough to see my tent, but hadn't made themselves known. That wasn't normal. I considered packing up right then, but it was early, and I figured maybe it was just a lost hiker passing through. I pushed it to the back of my mind and spent the day hiking a few miles upriver. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, tired but calmer. That night, the air felt heavier, and the forest seemed quieter than before. I got the fire going, ate, and turned in early. Couldn't have been more than an hour after I fell asleep when I woke to the same sound. Slow, careful steps. This time, I didn't move. I lay there with my hand on the revolver, my ears straining. The steps came closer, then stopped. The air outside the tent felt charged, like the way the woods go silent before a storm. Then, faintly, I heard breathing. Not the deep, steady breath of sleep or the loud huff of an animal, but slow, human breathing. I slid my hand inside my pack and quietly clicked on my flashlight. In one motion, I unzipped the tent a few inches and shone the beam out. For a split second, the light caught something, a figure maybe 20 feet away standing between the trees. The beam reflected off something near their face, maybe glasses or binoculars. I couldn't tell. The moment the light hit them, they turned and melted into the trees, moving fast but without a word. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with the revolver on my lap. Every so often, I thought I heard movement in the distance, but I never saw them again. To first light, I packed everything as fast as I could. I doused the fire, slung my pack in the truck, and started the engine. The dirt road out seemed longer than before, every shadow between the trees feeling like a pair of eyes watching me leave. About a mile from camp, I passed an old pickup parked in a pull-off, faded red with no plates. The windows were fogged from the cold, but I could see gear inside. Tarps, rope, a water jug, and something else that looked like a large hunting knife stuck upright in the seat. There was no one in or around it. I didn't stop. When I finally hit pavement, the tension in my chest eased, but I couldn't shake the thought that whoever that was hadn't been out there by accident. They weren't lost. They'd been watching me. I never reported it. I didn't even tell anyone about it for years, but I haven't camped alone since, and every time I pass a stretch of deep woods, I think about those slow, deliberate steps in the dark, and the person who stood there, just watching, in the middle of the night. I went hunting in the fall of 2016, deep in the northern woods of Minnesota, about 30 miles from the nearest town. I was 32 at the time, used to spending days in the wilderness, but this trip was the farthest I had gone from any marked trail. I had been saving up vacation days for this week, and I wanted nothing more than to be completely alone in the cold, quiet woods, far from people and noise. I parked my truck at the end of a muddy logging road and carried my gear the rest of the way. My pack was heavy: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, extra clothes, a small hatchet, and enough food to last me the week if hunting didn't go as planned. I also had my rifle slung over my shoulder, along with a sidearm I usually carried for safety. The air was crisp, the leaves underfoot damp and soft. I could smell pine and the faint rot of wet leaves. By the time I reached the clearing I had marked on my map, it was late afternoon. The sun sat low between the trees, casting long shadows that made the forest feel deeper and more endless. I set up my tent near the edge of a small frozen pond. The ice was thin, cracked in places, but still held the reflections of bare trees and the pale sky. It was quiet except for the occasional creak of the ice or the distant call of a crow. The first 2 days went smoothly. I scouted the area, found fresh deer tracks, and even saw a buck on the ridge to the north, though it was too far for a clean shot. At night, the temperature dropped fast, and I kept my small fire low so it wouldn't give me away to wildlife or to anyone else. That's the thing about being far out in the woods. You start thinking less about animals and more about the rare, but real possibility of running into people you don't want to meet. On the third night, I stayed out later than usual, trying to follow a trail I thought might lead to a bedding area. By the time I headed back, it was darker than I expected, and I had to use my headlamp. The forest felt different at night, thicker, more closed in. My breath was visible in the beam of my light, and every sound carried farther. I kept hearing faint cracks behind me, but when I stopped, the sound stopped. It was probably just the woods settling, or maybe a deer moving somewhere out of sight. Still, I didn't like it. When I reached camp, I noticed something odd. My small pile of split wood was scattered, not the way I had left it. I thought maybe a raccoon or something had nosed through it, but the pieces were spread too far for that. I checked the tent. The zipper was still closed, but there were boot prints in the dirt, larger than mine, leading away into the trees. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire low and my rifle within reach. Every small noise outside made my heart kick up. Around midnight, I heard what I thought was a person's footsteps just beyond the edge of the firelight. They moved slowly, deliberate, then stopped. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, straining to hear, but eventually the sound faded. The next morning, I decided to move my camp deeper into the woods, closer to the ridge where I'd seen the buck. I packed quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The air was colder that day, and frost covered the grass and fallen leaves. I hiked for a couple of hours until I found a new spot, a narrow clearing bordered by thick spruce. I set up the tent with my back to the trees so I could watch the open ground in front of me. That evening, while I was cleaning my rifle, I noticed movement on the far side of the clearing. A figure stepped between the trees and stopped, maybe 50 yards away. I couldn't make out much detail in the fading light, but I could tell it was a man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and just standing there. He wasn't moving toward me, just watching. My stomach dropped. I kept my hands on the rifle but didn't raise it. After what felt like a full minute, he turned and walked back into the trees without a word. I sat there for hours, my fire unlit, listening for him to return. Every so often, I thought I heard something in the distance, but nothing came close again that night. By the 5th day, I was done. Hunting was the last thing on my mind now. I packed up before sunrise, planning to head straight for the truck. The woods were still, almost unnaturally quiet. No wind, no birds. My boots crunched on frozen leaves as I pushed through the undergrowth. About halfway back, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. One of my own camp markers. I had tied strips of orange flagging tape to trees on my first day to help me find my way around. This one was tied at eye level, but the strip had been cut clean in half. I never cut them myself. Someone else had been through here. I kept moving, faster now, trying to keep my breathing steady. The terrain felt different, even though I knew I was on the right path. I kept checking my back trail, scanning for movement. At one point, I thought I saw something dark move between the trees behind me, but when I stopped, nothing was there. The final stretch to the truck felt like it took hours. When I finally saw the outline of it through the trees, my relief was sharp but short-lived. There were fresh tire tracks next to mine. Mud sprayed in a way that told me another vehicle had been here recently. My driver's side door had mud on the handle, like someone had tried it. I had locked it before leaving. I unlocked the truck with shaking hands, tossed my gear inside, and started the engine. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was miles down the road. When I finally did, the empty stretch of road behind me looked too quiet, like it was waiting. I never saw the man again. I don't know if he was following me from the start, or if I just wandered into his part of the woods. What I do know is that the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I got home. Even now, when I'm out hunting, I keep my camps tighter, my fires smaller, and my eyes on the dark between the trees, because out there, it's not always the animals you have to worry about.